If I told you you were sort of lied to about how the financial system actually works, and there's two primary truths that we're going to go through today, starting with one which I think is quite groundbreaking, and the research is very new. The state does not need taxation to spend. We always think that the state is a restrained actor that needs to borrow, but by its very nature, it creates money first and taxes after remove money from circulation. It does not need taxation to fund itself, which changes everything when it comes to understanding the political position we're in. And that two, commercial banks create money and change the economy when they issue loans. They add new money into circulation. If you're wondering why assets and financial markets are the hallmark of growth, but yet the productive economy is failing around us, you have to ask yourself, who's responsible? Who has the origins of where money is created? And these two pieces of information are the biggest truths that we can discover. And I've been talking to AI over the last few months. And last week we done an episode called The Bank versus the State. This is where we set up the two primary actors, the state, the government, and what their restraints and powers are, and the banks, what can they do and what do they do that changes the economy. We're going to jump straight into our first scene, but wait to the end. We got two pieces of research that show this to be true and straight from the horse's mouth. The Bank of England done a research paper that already explains that new money is created. Banks don't borrow from savings and use your money to stimulate the economy and to loan. They create money and therefore change the economy around us every time they issue a loan. These are facts. These are proven systems. The state spends first, as the research papers will show, and AI has said. Taxation comes after. They don't use the taxation like a pot of money. And I think these things do change everything and help us craft a better understanding of what we want from our politics and what growth we can see if we can change these habits and really understand these systems and what they do. So we're going to set up the first scene. There's lots that we picked out the best bits from the AI chat, and these are going to set up the actors, the state and the bank. Then we're going to get to the good bits of what these truths really mean for us in the economy. Okay, let's jump straight to it.
There are two main ways money is created in modern economies. One, private money creation. That's when commercial banks create money by issuing loans. It makes up the overwhelming majority of the money supply. Two, public money creation. That's when the state spends more than it taxes. It usually borrows through bonds, sometimes supported by the central bank. They're fundamentally different, not just in mechanics, but in who benefits and who ultimately controls the flow.
Yeah, when I think of like how you'd start economics as a, everyone needs a little bit of economic understanding if they're going to have, I suppose, political viewpoints that they can lean towards. The commercial bank is the vehicle for all money creation. The banks play, obviously, as everyone knows, a humongous role, and the state, who has its own vehicles for credit creation and trying to, should we say, increase or reduce demand in the economy. So that's the framework to sort of build the conversation on. It gets quite interesting the more we dig deeper, but they are the two actors for the conversation for today: the state, the commercial banks, and what their roles are. But we're going to crack on. There's some really interesting ones here.
Consistent with historic trend line.
So we're about to go into a system check. So this is effectively our AI equivalent of give me the data moment. So I'm talking to AI and then I say, look, prompt is run a system check. This is your chance to give me the data, break something down that I don't quite understand, because I'm just, trying to self-teach myself at this point. So I'm with everyone in trying to sort of break down what sounds like something that's really hard to understand. This is a quote, this is a system check for how the banks lend in, practically lend, who they lend to, because it will really start to matter the more we dig into these different conversations. Where does the bank, generally speaking, all the banks operate with a similar sort of mantra from the central banks, but there are key fundamentals about where they lend to, and that matters, and we want to get straight into it.
1. Property and real estate, 60 to 70%.
Yeah.
Most of the credit goes straight into property, not new homes, existing homes, mortgages, buy-to-let, commercial real estate, refinancing. This isn't building the future economy. It's bidding up the price of assets that already exist.
I suppose if you're going to critique property and the way it operates, we all need a home. We all know it's getting way too expensive. The question is, if banks are lending the majority of their money into assets like property, what do you presume would happen as a direct result? This is where the whole idea of where money is created matters more than, so we say, personal decisions, because we all want to go to where it's most profitable in the economy. But if that's an asset which doesn't have productive capabilities, it doesn't create labour necessarily in the same way starting a business would. It doesn't. It already increases, you say, inflates the cost of an asset when banks choose to lend predominantly into those housing markets. So this is unfortunately the reality of the bank lending practice. And you probably have already a good gut feeling of this.
2. Financial sector and speculation, 20 to 25%. This is lending to hedge funds, private equity, trading desks, structured products, margin loans, and corporate buybacks. None of this produces goods or services. It produces asset inflation. 3.
When we talk about the stock market, obviously a lot of the Western countries, maybe more the UK and the US, everyone knows we're a bit of a tax haven or a bit of a city-centric. London, the city of London, the Wall Street. We are tremendously financialized, economies, and that just means that obviously most of the money that flows in is going into the markets, and that doesn't necessarily create the same, should we say, pattern of productivity. For example, if you compare it into investing into more labor-intensive businesses where there's lots of jobs created, I think we'd probably be fair to say that stocks are not the necessarily best vehicle for that. And so these are examples of where money already goes in the economy, and that's why this stuff really matters. If you're basing your judgments on how we can improve the economy, it could fundamentally start with, where does money go?
Consumer credit, 10% credit cards, personal loans, car finance, overdrafts. This is borrowing to survive, not to build.
Yeah, I don't know what the statistic is. I think I probably should have asked AI to get it out, but I think it's something like, I think in the US it has something like 30, and people have over 6 million people have something like £30,000 worth of like credit card, debt, and it's getting worse. This is a lot of people, living paycheck to paycheck. I think Instagram might make us feel like everyone's living the life of Riley or whatever. Everyone's having a good time, showcasing their best self. But consumer credit is a big concern, and that debt is a problem because it's obviously just depleting people's income, so they can't stimulate the economy. You can't pay for stuff, then the economy starts stalling. Credit and debt for consumer type products can be really dangerous to the economy.
4. Small and medium-sized enterprises, also referred to as the real economy, the part of the economy that creates 2/3 of new jobs, gets around 5% of credit, sometimes less.
Yeah, and that's the biggest one probably for the conversation. Small businesses get such a small amount of money in terms of the global credit flow from banks. So if you are a small business, I am too, it is a tough place to be. There's obviously high interest rates as well, loans which don't help. You could stimulate the economy by reducing some of those for small businesses. But for the purposes of this assessment, for the system check, it's such a fractional degree of where money flows. And that is where, when it says, the AI says, creates most of the jobs, I think it's something like 60% of jobs are still created through small businesses, but yet it gets such a small degree of income. And if you start to weigh up on one side a massive amount of money going into assets and property, on the other hand, you have, productive side of the economy, and that's what it's said to be the productive side of the economy because it's the largest employer. It stimulates a lot of buying activity. Picture £100,000 in the hands of a asset like a housing investment versus £100,000 into wages. You have a completely different structure around how much activity that money would create in terms of flow between people. Instead of, also you could go into financial markets. People sit on their assets, and then they lend against them, which means that most of the time they're not taxed as well. For many years they defer effectively taxing the selling stocks because they can just sit on them and assets inflate, then they can loan against them. It's a very sort of bent way for people to use money through their stocks and shares. Not necessarily the right way to build the marketplace, I'd imagine.
Truth
Anyways,
override.
move on.
This is not a malfunction. This is profit-driven allocation.
So profit-driven allocation, i.e., the banks will lend to where's most profitable and safest. Doesn't mean that's the right way, and I think there's something you'll probably have your own opinion on where you think money's going. It doesn't quite feel right at the moment. These are vehicles and areas that we can understand and sort of learn together around where money goes. Probably does have a larger effect than what a politician says they're going to do. So this is where credit creation, bank v the state, is the opening of the conversation for this. I want to get into a bit of a different chat here, but it moves along on the state side now. I guess, what about the state then? We always hear about taxes, but is it true that countries like the UK, the US, Japan, the big one, can make their own money? As sovereign nations. Why do we talk about governments needing to raise taxes to fund spending then?
That's one of the most misunderstood truths in economics.
Here we go.
Yes, the UK, US and Japan are monetary sovereigns. They issue their own currencies. Technically, they don't need taxes or bond sales before spending. They create money first, then tax later to manage inflation. But in practice, they act like households. They borrow, they issue bonds, and they treat taxes as if they're the source of funding. So
this is actually a breakout episode that's really it's got to be such a deep dive into it to give it value. But what the AI is saying really here is that the state doesn't need taxation to spend. The structural accounting system of the Bank of England, which we'll go into in more detail, doesn't require taxation in the way you think. It's not a pot of gold, that they use to spend. Money is actually issued through spending into the economy first. That's how, for example, you get quantitative easing, where you think to yourself, like, how the hell does 300 million quid appear from nowhere? Well, the state didn't have the tax money, did it? It obviously created it. Everyone knows that there's an uncomfortable idea that in the UK, for example, if you're from the US, it may be different, but the Federal Reserve has the same power and capabilities. When COVID hit, suddenly money appears. This magic money tree Conservatives talked about since the 80s, and we get it still now with Labour. The idea there is no magic money tree. But Bank of England, if you see that, you're probably standing out. If they're saying it, usually outside the Bank of England, which is in effect a magic money tree. Now we could talk about where money goes and how much of it's right and wrong, but the very nature of the idea that the state needs taxation to spend is just a myth. It is not even a debatable fact. It is just a myth. The mechanical structure of it, which we're going to do a whole episode on it, is just in effect if you think of the Bank of England as someone that records taxation coming in and issues money out, that would be the best way to explain it. Simplistic, but the accounts don't need money. And we've got some really good stuff at the end. We're trying to pull out some research papers which are only about a year or two old, that explain these fundamentals in terms of actually accounts, where the money goes, where does it come from. It gets stimulated through the Bank of England. Anyway, we'll continue with the reflection.
That's not a technical constraint.
Yeah,
it's a political and ideological choice, enforced by bond markets and economic orthodoxy.
Yeah, when it says AI trying to be clever, it's like, economic orthodoxy. How economics maybe is being taught, developed, there's challenges from, should we say, more Marxist economics, where they're discussing that, and MMT, they're discussing that the state has more powers than it lets on. Economic orthodoxy is that effectively the governments believe in, or at least the UK pretend to believe, US maybe is a bit different, but the full funding rule, meaning that the Bank of England's role isn't just the state's role isn't just to stimulate the economy and to cover payments, which I think sounds reasonable. But what that really means is they lend or generate money through the bond markets, which we're getting to, in order to create money. And the deficit is a surplus, which we've got a really good episode on as well. So understanding what the deficit is, but for purposes of this, we're just going to say that the state has the power to create money, and that money in reality isn't fixed to taxation.
So when a politician says we can't afford it, we need to raise taxes first, That's not economics. That's narrative.
Wow, yeah, that's a big one. I've seen some of this stuff discussed in MMT circles, so it's like modern monetary theory. It sometimes feels a bit like too much of an idea to overcome, like, if we can tie it to sovereign bonds, like how the country borrows. It'd be interesting to sort of find out more. Is that basically the state's taking out a loan? Am I right? It's probably terrible framing. It's not really the state taking out a loan, but in format, it's government generating money through the bond markets. The full funding rule meaning that we'd rather loan money in reality than should we say generate it through the central bank. Even the central bank is one of the vehicles of which creates our money. It's a bit complicated, but the idea is that there is a market which has control over, should we say, influence on the government if they take money from them.
Spot on. Here's exactly how it works.
Here we go.
Government spends, central bank credits reserves. Treasury sells bonds to drain those reserves. It doesn't have to sell the bonds, it chooses to. Why? Because sovereign bond markets have become a disciplinary force. If markets don't like your policies, they sell bonds. Yields rise. Suddenly you're told, you can't afford this. The markets are nervous.
Yeah, the full funding rule is the reason behind this, and also markets believe that government should act responsibly, i.e. they should be the actors, if you like, in stimulating the economy, and the government would be someone who is meant to support the economy, but not in the way in which utilising money or creating money is. It's a sort of weird dichotomy, really. But this is the bond market, this is effectively the role in which it plays. It has some leverage over the government. If you do just decide to spend into the economy, the government decides to stimulate it, bond markets do have a direct way to weaken the overall cost for you to generate income through this, through bond sales. It's a bit more complicated than what AI probably explains here, and there's also other variables. But the key bit to understand is that the bond market is another tool for the government generating money to spend. Okay, moving on.
It's financial power shaping political decisions. Modern states don't need to borrow to spend, but they do. And that debt becomes a leash. One end tied to democratic policy, the other held by the market.
Yeah, that's they can spend more before taxing. Then most of the public spending decisions aren't really about whether politicians, it's more about whether they're winning. I'm muddling my way through this, but I'm basically trying to say, like, if the government has the power to, create money, then it's really the willpower of the politicians to decide to use these economical tools instead of using the ideology that the state doesn't have the power to do anything. It's like a guy in a boxing ring who's a world champion, but he's tied two hands behind his back, and he says, I can't actually fight. But then he can pull his hands out 2 minutes and start swinging. If a boxing analogy works, anyway, to do something, then, and whether the markets will let them. Then there's a lot of sort of conversation around whether bond markets do have power over the government's ability to make decisions on on its own finances. Some research would suggest the Bank of England, being one of the largest debtors, which is basically we have the power still to usurp and do decisions for ourselves. The bond market wouldn't actually hold us to account, but that's more research coming out time and time again.
Precisely. The constraint on public spending in 2025 is almost never actual money. It's fear of market retaliation. And that fear is what keeps austerity alive. Yeah, austerity if you're from the US is a bit different, but in the UK, basically the Conservative government believed that they had a responsibility to bring down the deficit, and the deficit is, if you like, a positive net balance to the private economy. What the government creates as a deficit is kind of stimulated loans and money into the economy, and it's a net benefit to the private side. So you can think of like the deficit as a surplus for private sector. So when the government spends more, it stimulates growth. So we'll probably do a whole break episode on what that really means in terms of like, well, is it good when the state spends, or bad? There'd be a lot of different variables, but it'd be an interesting one. Carrying on. Even in a world where money can be created. The biggest lie the state can
and actively does, sort of through convoluted methods and not really explaining how, create money all the time. And it can do, if you decide that you think the economy needs reshaping, we can stimulate growth, through effectively state issue credit creation. Thank you, central bank. Wow. Yeah. So if I'm hearing you right, both commercial banks and sovereign states have the power to create money. Banks use it for profit, I guess, and end up steering the whole economy. States could use it for public good more so, but sort of decide to borrow more like households. I'm sure there's an economical structure behind it, but they do take orders from the market. So technically, just to be clear, bond markets have been around since the monarchs, of empire. So the idea of lending through the bond market's been around for a long time. The question is it a driving factor for how we generate income for the state? I think we could have some questions whether it's a necessity or just a decision that could be could be changed. Two engines, but both are steered like for profit and I guess by power, is what you're saying. I would like to say about the tying your hands behind your back in the boxing analogy. If the state decides to tie its hand, the only drivers in the economy really is the banking system. So if you like to think of a trade of power, it could be framed in that way. If the state decides not to act in the economy, then usually private capital will win via the commercial banking side, because that is where the driver of the economy is. You're going down the motorway at 90 miles per hour, you look across and the car's trailing, and that's the state, while you got a runaway driver in the front seat of the fast vehicle, and that's the commercial banks. Not sure if that analogy works.
Money is created in different ways, but power decides where it flows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess once people see the state and the bank in sort of this way, it opens up a completely different conversation, sort of, not the left and right political argument, but, what we come back. I do have to be careful with the left and right, because there's left wing, right wing economic ideologies, but I just mean in generally people debating the idea in left and right wing, who's the right party, but yet the party is not discussing anything which affects their day-to-day economics of their life. For example, if you voted Labour after maybe Margaret Thatcher, you could maybe debate that Tony Blair, for example, was very close to the power bed of the same ideology that Thatcher would have had in terms of trickle down economics, where bringing money in and letting rich people get richer, restricted public investments. Anyway, to again sort of where the credit allocation is about who gets the money and I guess why.
That's the real system. Banks create money to maximise return. States create money, but anchor that power to market approval. The result? Most money flows where profit is highest, not where need is greatest.
And that's a question maybe for more of an ideological one around how you see the society. But if you say the state is not a primary actor in the economy, then you choose that economy that's driven by the financialized side of the economy, as we said earlier, the banks. So it's an interesting decision you can make by taking yourself out, should we say, of the fight.
Until we change how money is created and directed, we'll keep mistaking scarcity for necessity.
Mistaking scarcity for necessity is the idea that I guess the state itself decides not to act, as we've said before, but you think they don't have the money. There's two different very conversations. One is just a lie, a direct lie. There is always the ability to create money. If the government wants to stimulate the economy, it can do. If it built 200,000 new homes, it may affect the asset owning side of the economy, but for the most part it would stimulate a massive upside for productivity, and the government would make money on that investment. So that's kind of a business fundamental. If a business invests, you expect a return. The state has those abilities, but it's not restricted by actually the money it has. That's the key bit. It's not restricted by having access to taxation money, and that really matters, and that's the biggest lie. That scarcity for necessity. That's interesting. That's a pretty brutal recap. I want to ask you straight, is this something you've laid out in this episode, the two engines, the private allocation, I guess you call it a disaster, the public engine sort of on a leash. Is this still a fringe idea? Is it quietly widely accepted among the people that actually study this stuff in economics?
It's no longer fringe anymore. The mechanics we described Banks create money through lending. The state spends before taxing or borrowing. Bond sales are a policy choice, not a necessity. Are now textbook at the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, the ECB, the BIS, and in every serious monetary economics department on earth. You can open the BOE's own 2014 paper, still on their website in 20...
I think I'm going to pause it there. This is the two, I guess, main elements of the conversation. I'll pull up two research papers literally in 1 minute that will showcase that the state by nature doesn't need taxation to spend, and secondarily how commercial banks actually create money when they issue loans. And these are the two myths that, if you want to sort of pick your poison, around how you want the government to spend, that's fine. But if you want to judge the economy on what is actually the operational restraints, then these are the two myths that we can debunk, and this lie can die today. I'm going to grab those papers and we'll be back in 30 seconds. Okay, I'm back. So I actually pulled up the Bank of England's 2014 paper, which the AO actually pulled out as evidence-based research for the chat. So here's a couple of really important lines that kind of help sort of say demystify the idea of how money actually is created in the economy. So the highlight here, literally I'm up on, I think, page 2 or 3. This is the Bank of England. And to note, there is an amazing economics expert called Richard Werner, who was like almost the godfather of quantitative easing, even though it wasn't necessarily done as to his recommendations, as he says himself. Actually done an empirical study on actually asking banks, because you can imagine for like 50, 60 years, people talking about how money operates in the economy and economics making their modeling. But yet the fundamental of how money is created is still not popularly agreed or understood. Imagine you're basing a prediction, but one of the main filters of which you're doing your algorithmic research or data cohesion is fundamentally missing some large variables. So here is the killer line, for example. So commercial banks create money in the form of bank deposits by making new loans. When a bank makes a loan, for example, to someone taking out a mortgage to buy a house, it does not typically do so by giving out £1,000 of banknotes. Well, that's obvious. Instead, it credits their account with deposits in the size. So this is the same for any type of loan, generally speaking. At that moment, new money is created. It is not, it says here further in the article, which I read through, it obviously explains that banks don't use other forms of people's money and savings to create loans. That's how the movement of money goes through a bank accounts, and that's how banks effectively operate, or what their role and facility is in the economy, is to handle monetary payments, and they create money when they issue a loan. Also, contrary to sort of some understanding, and it sort of confused me, but we can get to the reasoning behind it. Down here at the bottom, just as taking out a new loan creates money, the repayment of bank loans destroys money. So when you're paying back a loan from a bank, effectively that money is destroyed and the interest is kept by the commercial bank as profit, I guess. You could argue over the pros and cons of allowing an economical part of your entire model of how to run society when profit is a major factor. Banking has some real big flaws in it, and one of its fundamentals, I think, is it's innate chasing of profitability, and that's, I'm not sure if you build economics on the theory that people operate in a predictable fashion, when one of your largest variables is very unpredictable, the commercial banks. So just to recap, we have commercial banks create new money in the form of deposits. Bank loans is new money created. So if that helps you make a judgment on economics, really it did a lot for me. It made a massive difference when I understood these variables, because I think you start to piece together gaps in what feels like, oh, okay, that's why economics feels a bit weird. I thought they always loan out people's money. I thought the government is involved in helping stimulate the economy. Commercial banks are the vehicles for credit creation. Pretty much all money in the economy is debt. Every time you spend something, it once originated from this place. So if you ask yourself, what society are we building? You have one of the pivotal moments to stand back and go, okay, this is the root. This is everything else in the economy is downstream of these behaviors. So this is where we look. I can hop straight over to the next one, which effectively is running through how the state doesn't need taxation to spend, and that it actually spends first, in fact, which is quite overwhelming, but I think it matters a lot because you'll hear it in politics all the time. We have no money, we have no money. Well, this isn't the case. Okay, I'm gonna hop back across. I'm gonna grab this article up. Okay, I'm back. So this is the UCL's research. I think it's 2025, so it's maybe last year, the self-financing state, in which they were sort of investigating the roles of which taxation and state expenditure work, so government spending and revenue collection. This is this overview massive diagram, which will be used. I'll probably use to break down in a future episode. It looks very convoluted, but imagine you have the Bank of England here, just to try and give some context, and it has these multiple account structures. There's one here that we need to note, and that's the Consolidation Fund. This is one of the primary accounts in which monetary revenue is the expenditure comes from, and this account itself returns to zero every day. It moves money through to the National Loans Fund, but imagine for the purpose of the conversation that if you're identifying how the state operates, it's within the Bank of England for revenue expenditure. Should we say just expenditure? Revenue collection would be taxation, which they have. This article is pretty, I think it's groundbreaking and it's an amazing piece of research, but we're going to move straight down to the bit where it gets at the heart of the matter. I'm going to go straight down to the discussion points. I'm skimming all the way down. This is the tax collection section, which is really interesting. It shows that basically it's separate routes for the taxation money that is from the government spending. Let's go straight down. This is a really great sort of discussion point here at the bottom. So we're going to jump straight into here. In regard to sequencing for public spending and liquidity risk, in section 3, this is related to the diagrams, shows there's no requirement for provisioning of money through taxation and borrowing activities to occur before government spending can be undertaken. As such, there are no circumstances where it can be said that government has insufficient money for expenditure to be able to take place within government, and there's no risk of running out of money. Now, there's a lot of other points in this research paper which I think are really, really interesting. It explains that the central bank can sort of by policy not say no, should we say, to the government for spending, and spending is issued through the Treasury. This, I would say, is one of the most fundamental points, that if you can absorb and believe these things to be true, then it can change your whole ideology on when you hear politicians lie down the camera, or they're either ignorant, which is fine, they don't understand that what they're saying is factually inaccurate, or they start propping up a system which they're wanting to keep in place, which works for them and doesn't work for you. So constraints on government spending is not a limitation of access to money. Taxation doesn't fund spending. Many research papers have explained this, and many economics, I'm sure professors have talked about this, but this is a great article, and I'll put the links for both the 2014 government Bank of England one and this on government spending. I would love to reach out to the guys that done this research paper too, because I think it's, as I say, groundbreaking the way they broke everything down. Look into the Consolidation Fund. We're going to do an episode on it, but it's a remarkable account which seems to be effectively a vehicle for credit creation via the state. We won't get into the whys and hows today, but it'll be something that we'll cover in further in detail over the next sort of couple of months. But anyway, as of today, the bank versus the state. Hopefully, there's some interesting talking points. I think there's a couple of obvious take homes. The two major myths: the banks create all their money through credit creation, and in effect, that is how the economy is, should we say, stimulated. These are things that come and carry major risks in conversations if you aren't aware of those things, and it's something which I've tried to dig in and understand, but there's some amazing economics people out there doing this, and I tried to do some sort of review and reaction videos to their stuff too. But AI is doing an amazing job at helping empower me to understand stuff that I had no idea how they work, and I think it can empower you, and hopefully we share some of the journey together. But anyway, I hope to see everyone on the next one. Hopefully it was an interesting chat. I might cut some of these up for shorter videos because there's some long topics discussed. But yeah, I'll speak to you soon. Take care. Bye guys.